A new poll claims a third of Europeans see the US as the world's biggest threat to global stability. Is it true? And what can the states do to sort out its image? This is Inside Story. Hello, I'm Imran Garda. Does the United States have an image problem? Well, a new poll suggests it does, both at home and abroad. According to the research, almost a third of Europeans think the US poses the biggest threat to world stability. And while the US itself sees Iran and North Korea as the biggest risks, young Americans share the European view that the biggest threat is their own country. The findings come from a survey carried out by UK-based Harris Research for British newspaper The Financial Times. People were polled in Spain, France, Germany, Italy and the UK. The results? Well, 32% of Europeans in the 5 countries saw the US as the biggest threat to stability. Spanish citizens were the most concerned about the US, with 46%, nearly half, seeing it as the greatest risk. 35% of Americans aged 16 to 24 saw their own country as the biggest peril. Now, the United States argues that its critics ignore or misunderstand its positive influence in the world. Washington instead points to its intervention in Kosovo to end attacks against ethnic Albanians that caused thousands of deaths and saw tens of thousands displaced in the last Yugoslav war. The toppling of Saddam Hussein ended one of the region's most brutal regimes and was meant to deliver a wave of democratization across the Middle East. And support for Lebanese independence saw the final Syrian troops leave in April 2005. That has subsequently promised up to $1 billion to the country's reconstruction and security. Well, joining us are our guests in London, Jeremy Corbyn, a Labour Member of Parliament; in Washington, D.C., Amr Hamzawi, a Senior Associate at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace; and also in Washington is Arielle Cohen, a Senior Fellow at the Heritage Foundation. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. Jeremy Corbyn in London, I'm going to start off with you. 32% of Europeans see the US as the biggest threat to world stability. Does that surprise you?
Not really, no. I think the degree of feeling against the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan are enormous, and there's also a growing feeling, I suspect, of a European identity that's in the minds of many people that is contrary to the US view of a world power. And I think sort of George Bush's interventions around the world have, if anything, increased hostility to US policies around the world, but conversely not hostility to the United States or to its citizens.
Yeah, interesting. Arielle Cohen, I'm going to bring you in here. Would you agree that the disaster that is the US policy in Iraq has contributed mostly to this resentment?
Well, if I want to split hair, I would call it a failure, not a disaster. But the main thing is that U.S. has an image problem, and we knew it all along. U.S. failed to engage those who attacked it on 9/11 in the realm of ideas. We're losing the war of ideas. I've written extensively about it, and we need leadership, and we need good policy, strategy, and execution to turn the tide. But I will also remind our viewers that the United States was attacked for its intervention in Vietnam historically, for deployment of the missiles in Europe to protect Europe against the Soviet threat. So Europe has a stable and large left wing, and this is where the sentiment is coming from.
But would you say that foreign policy at the moment is failing?
I would say that public diplomacy, the explanation of foreign policy, is in pretty bad shape. I would agree with that.
Amr Hamzawi, do you believe that anti-Americanism worldwide has deepened or widened, or both?
It has deepened and widened, and it's not only an image problem. It would be misleading to portray it as if the US had only an image problem. There is a serious problem worldwide with US policy, especially with the Bush administration's policies, primarily in the Middle East and elsewhere. So it's not public diplomacy, and it's not the failure of this administration or any previous administration in communicating the right image of the US. It is a policy problem, and it is the lack of understanding and the serious doubts which great constituencies in Europe and elsewhere outside Europe, in the Middle East and elsewhere, share with regard to America's policies and policy steps over the last years.
Jeremy Corbyn in London, the poll was conducted in 5 Western European countries. Do you think that it would have been any different had they included some Eastern European countries?
It probably would have had a very confused set of results, with probably much more polarisation in the Eastern European countries. There is the deepest resentment in Poland and the Czech Republic over the questions of missile defence, and there's also enormous hostility in Russia to missile defence, because they see themselves as being once again the target of US missiles. There is, however, a strong sort of business-orientated community in those countries that has sided very much with the European right and the US in NATO and all those kind of forums. But I do think across Europe, young people are frankly appalled at US foreign policy around the world, this massive increase in arms expenditure, explosion of bases all around the world, numbers of bases all around the world, and of course the issue of the war in Iraq. I mean, has the United States been made safer by all its interventions since 2001? Answer no. Is the world a safer place? No. Is the policy working? Absolutely not. There needs to be a complete rethink by the US.
Amar Hamzawi, I see you nodding. Let's talk a little bit about the young people that Jeremy Corbyn mentioned. 35% of Americans between 16 and 25 see their own country as the biggest threat to international stability. Does that indicate some sort of success for left-wing politics and the anti-war movement in the States?
Yes, it definitely indicates a revival of the left in the US, and this is basically related to younger generations. And there are different indicators for it, not only popular opinion attitudes, but if you look at membership and different political associations in the 2 main parties in the US, there's a lot of indicators for a revival of the left. But it is, as my previous speaker just said, it is the issue of the outcomes of American policies in the region. Americans are as frustrated as Europeans. Many Americans are as frustrated as Europeans and Middle Easterners with regard to the outcomes. The Bush administration promised a democratic Middle East, created an extremely messy and crisis-dominated Middle East, promised to democratize the Arab countries, and ended up accepting religious movements and autocratic rulers staying in power or coming to power. So it is an issue of the outcomes and the results of American policies as well, not only what they promised or the wrong image which was transmitted.
Arielle Cohen, another poll that results came out last week, the Pew Poll released a week ago, saw positive ratings of the US from some countries, including Israel, Poland, Japan, India, amongst others. Why do you think those countries in particular?
Well, first of all, let's keep this in perspective. The minority of people in Europe view the United States as the greatest threat. And the majority of people, I submit to you, in Europe and around the world understand that what America stands for is so different than what people who attacked America on 9/11, who attacked Britain, who attacked London where Jeremy Corbyn is residing, stand for. So people are not stupid, and people keep it in perspective. What we're facing in UK, in Europe, in Russia, in Australia and elsewhere around the world is a clear and present danger. And as a former pollster myself, I have a problem with the Harris poll, because radical Islamic terrorism was not factored in as one of the factors of a foreign and defense threat. Look who they have there: US, China, Iran, Iraq, North Korea, Russia. We are living in a century where the greatest threat is coming from non-state actors.
But Arielle Cohen, wouldn't you agree that issues like Iraq, Abu Ghraib in Iraq, Guantanamo Bay, these issues have fostered irreversible resentment towards the US from many people, including those Europeans? Issues like delaying a ceasefire when Israel fought Hezbollah in Lebanon. Don't you think these issues upset people and affect them?
I think that, first of all, it's not irreversible. I think the United States has done a much better job during the Cold War explaining on the on the level of ideas and images and symbols, what we're standing for, we, with Europe, with the free world, and what the other side is standing for. And as a result, the Soviet Union had collapsed, not just because U.S. had a stronger military. As many of the jihadi terrorists said, this war is only 50% about bullets and guns. It's 50%, and I submit to you, it's more than 50% about ideas and symbols. And the United States, as a dominant power, is failing to fight this war. And I agree with my colleagues that the image may be suffering, not just in Europe, but as Amar Hamzawi said, in the Middle East. But this is because the United States is not explaining what is a stark choice today between Sharia states, Sharia societies, and terrorism on the one hand, and freedom and free markets on the other hand. We're not doing a good job.
Jeremy Corbyn, let me bring you in here because Arielle Cohen mentioned the likes of 7/7 and the Madrid bombings. Do you think that the Madrid bombings, 7/7, etc., would not have happened had Spain and Britain not joined the US in the attack on Iraq?
I was in London on 7/7 and people in my very own constituency died as a result of it, and we held memorial meetings and I attended funerals on behalf of those people that had died during that day. The response of the ordinary people of my community, which is a very mixed, very multicultural community, wasn't to support US policy. It was quite the opposite. They said that the US response to 9/11 and the stepping up of the war on terror and all the problems and atrocities in Iraq had actually exacerbated it and provoked this kind of crazy actions by some people around the world. And so I do think the US really needs to recognize that it has contributed to this whole atmosphere by its rhetoric and by its actions. But the other side of it is that it's often sort of dressed up as anti-American. I'm not anti-American. I was in Chicago only a week ago at various meetings of United for Peace and Justice against the war in Iraq. And what was impressive to me is that the US Congress has actually voted to withdraw troops from Iraq. It's only Bush and his veto and his administration that is not representing what is apparently the wishes of the majority of the United States people.
Gentlemen, stay with us. Time for a short break here on Inside Story. When we come back, we talk about other countries the Europeans think represent a threat to peace. Do stay with us.